Well, anyhow, welcome to Keele. For those who've not been here before, it's lovely to see you. Welcome to friends who've been here before. I'm full of trepidation actually, but I'm really looking forward to it as well. I think in terms of housekeeping, there's not a great deal to say. I'm not being told that there's any fire alarms. I think there's some nice fire exit signs for you to follow if you need to. In terms of the programme, we're fairly tight for time, so I'm going to have to try and be fairly strict with that. And I'm very grateful to the speakers who've been willing to partake and share their memories of the last 30 years. And perhaps you can think about the future as well, maybe. We'll see. So I thought we'd start off with Mark, who I'm very pleased to say has been recently promoted to Professor of Pathology here at Keele. So it's just a careful timing on there. I'm staying on as an emeritus professor, and I'll try to do that as well. Mark's going to give us a little bit of an overview, like introduction to the renal research. The first half of the programme is a little research orientated. It talks a bit about different research endeavours and partnerships. And the second half of the afternoon is focusing more on world nephrology and a little bit of the arts creeps in towards the afternoon. At the end of the afternoon, with Edwina talking about some using art, and I'm going to talk a bit about music in case you haven't guessed by now. So, Mark, I think we're ready to start. Looking the heads up from Matt, that Matt is keeping an eye on the online people, and hopefully will let us know if they want to say anything. Mark. That's important how it works.
Hello, thank you. So, Simon's asked me to talk about an overview of renal research at Keele. So I thought I'd just start off with some nice pictures of Keele. Give a pointer. It's a nice view of Keele and an entirely representative view of Stoke-on-Trent. But I should also just point out that I could also probably rename the talk, which would be Simon's research at Keele, because the two are not completely confluent, but 99% confluence there. So I'm going to start off therefore where Simon started, which was 1989, I think. But the first major research he set up was the Stoke PD cohort. So this was a single centre cohort study, which was a really useful methodology at the time, in that peritoneal dialysis was still relatively new treatment, and there was still quite a lot of uncertainty about what happened to the patients, what the outcomes would be. So you could get quite a lot of information out of a simple single centre cohort study. And from that, this has had a fairly key role in quite a few of these observations. So it was recognising the importance of the peritoneal membrane, which is what it's perhaps best known for, identifying its role in mortality, identifying that it deteriorates over time, and that deterioration, it wasn't just an increase in vascularity, which increased solid transport, but it was also an increase in the scarring process, and that scarring process drove a deterioration in fluid removal during dialysis. It was then leading on to some observations around encapsulating peritoneal sclerosis, which was a fairly catastrophic complication of peritoneal dialysis that was particularly a problem in the noughties, and that was recognising that as effectively the end point of that damaging process driving up to encapsulating peritoneal sclerosis. And then, having identified that there's a damaging process occurring, identifying the drivers of that, and particularly peritonitis and glucose. It wasn't just that, there were also some other observations, and that included the role of comorbidity, and he did devise the Stoke comorbidity score, or as it's often called, the Davies comorbidity score, and that has then been widely used in a variety of other peritoneal dialysis studies, as it's a very simple and pragmatic tool to use. The other thing he did fairly early on was identifying opportunities for research within Keele, and in particular identifying that David Smith and Patrick Spanel, who I think are going to be, well, Patrick's going to be talking later, identifying that their technique had some potential relevance to his own research within peritoneal dialysis. And I don't want to talk about it in length, but it was particularly recognising that this technique could then be used to study how water is being transferred across the membrane in dialysis patients, and also how it's being distributed across the body, which is leading on to some observations around body composition, which is a theme that gets picked up later on in the research. So there are limitations to any study technique or methodology, and having done quite a lot of what he could do with the Stoke PD study, he was then recognised the opportunity. So when Nick Topley from Cardiff was setting up the global fluid study, recognising that as an opportunity to extend the work that could be done. So this is another observational cohort study, this time an international study, so focusing primarily on Korea, Canada and the UK. But the other novelty, that there was significant change from what was occurring with the Stoke PD cohort, was that there were biosamples being collected. So dialysated plasma would be collected longitudinally. So, and at the time, that was a very large study by PD study standards, PD being a very niche research area. So from that, there's been quite a variety of different pieces of work being done. That's just a quick snapshot of them. But really, the observations that I'm not going to talk really about the stuff that was led primarily by Cardiff, because there were some really important basic science projects there, but in terms of the work that Stoke had more involvement in, then the observations were really that peritoneal function was still determining mortality, despite the changes in treatment. But that the membrane function, more importantly, those changes seem to be driven by an inflammatory process within the peritoneum, in particular IL-6, and that there was a distinction between this peritoneal inflammation that's occurring during peritoneal dialysis and the inflammation that was occurring throughout the body in dialysis patients generally, that was already a recognised phenomenon. So these processes seem to be distinct, but possibly slightly overlapping in that the peritoneal inflammation may well, or probably does, contribute to that systemic inflammation. And that peritoneal inflammation deteriorates over time, so, and that seems to largely explain some of the deteriorations in membrane function which has already been observed in the Stoke PD cohort. So that was another of the science studies that he was heavily involved with. But then I mentioned that EPS was a fairly catastrophic complication of peritoneal dialysis, and it actually had quite a big risk to it in that it was affecting young fit patients, and it was associated with the duration of time on PD. So there's a real risk that people are going to start being taken off PD just to try and avoid that complication, because it was fairly bad. So we needed another cohort study, but with a different design and a slightly different mix of patients to try and address that. So that's where the PD Craft study came from. And it did achieve its primary goal, which was trying to estimate the risk of EPS and inform that so that more meaningful decisions could be made in clinic. But there was also an opportunity that Simon recognised, which is to say that the global fluid study had a lot of strengths, but one of the areas it didn't have was genetic material. So by collecting genetic material from this cohort, he was then able to contribute to some further work, and that led on to this paper, the New England paper, that was led by Olivier Davies. So that wasn't entirely based on the PD Craft cohort, and there was a lot of other work that they had to do for that paper, but even so, the PD Craft cohort was a very major contributor to the evidence in that paper. And again, that paper is picking up the themes of looking at the membrane function and how water is being transferred across the membrane over time and the implications of that for the patient outcome. So really informing our understanding of what happens to patients over time and why there are some of these differences in ultrafiltration. There was also the other study, which was led by Raj Malhotra, and again, the PD Craft was the vast majority of that patient cohort actually. And it was so successful that although the patient numbers weren't quite big enough for BioPD overall, there was a bit more money for a second follow-up to PD Craft. So we've got a theme of observational cohort studies, and it informed quite a lot, and there's quite a lot of evidence come out from them so far. But there was another area that had been, that was under another opportunity for them, which was to recognise the model that had been developed by the Arbor Collaborative for Help with the DOC study. And that was utilising the natural variation in practice across different units. And by studying those as practice patterns and their associations with outcome, you can then start to inform what the better practices are, so you can stop doing the ones that aren't so advantageous. And the DOC study has been going on for years, so there was a clear opportunity to extend that to PD patients, and that's exactly what Simon was heavily involved with. So he was the president of the ISPD at the time, and the BDOC study came out as a result of that collaboration between the ISPD and the Arbor Collaborative for Health. It's impossible to summarise that because it's a vast study. There's at least 28 papers so far, but that's and counting. And you can see from the numbers here that this is by a country mile the biggest study of PD patients so far. I mean, only registries have been bigger than that. So that's a lot of the slightly more historic studies. Moving on to slightly more current studies. There's the INTERCEPT study. So we've talked a lot about what happens to patients on PD and the problems that they have and the outcomes that they get. But a key bit that's missing there is getting patients onto PD in the first place. And again, this is then building on that natural variability between centres and recognising that that's also affecting getting patients onto PD. So that does mean that a theoretical patient who goes to one centre would end up not going on to PD and in another centre would. So it's using that natural variability to say what are the centres that have more patients getting onto PD doing that we should be replicating. And that's really the basis for the INTERCEPT study. And that's been adopting a collaboration between Keele and Birmingham and Sheffield. And because it's quite a complex question, it's got a mixed methods approach. So it's an ethnographic study, survey, there's a registry analysis with the survey, health economics, and intervention package being developed. And that's very much heavily informing the current national strategies around home dialysis leadership. One of the key findings actually from that is that the culture of the unit is probably the predominant issue that seems to determine the usage of home dialysis. So it's less about the details of what centres are doing and more about how that centre is led and managed. And there's recommendations coming out in a variety of areas. But I've talked so far entirely about the observational studies. If you really want to change practice, you also need to consider randomised controlled trials because they're more compelling when it comes to trying to change management of patients. I've not mentioned the fact that there's already been a nitidextrin study that Simon led that was a randomised controlled trial. But I can't really not mention the Bistro study. So this was again building on what Simon's work had been doing around body composition and fluid balance within peritoneal dialysis, but then recognising through that expertise that actually he was probably the natural lead for a randomised controlled trial of bioimpedance in haemodialysis patients. And that led on to this study, the Bistro study that's been recently published, and perhaps not to Simon's surprise, the bioimpedance wasn't having a massive impact on the outcomes of the patients. So I've got a fairly limited time and I've been having to try and get through quite a lot of work in a fairly short time span. I think there's some themes that have come out from just that brief overview of Simon's research. So I'd say that collaboration has been a key principle that's facilitated all that research. So I did try and actually do a slide that was going to go through all the people Simon worked with, and I just gave up because there was going to be far too many people and the text was going to be completely illegible. So I've not been able to mention any of the people really that he's been working with, but suffice to say that there's a very large number of them. I'd also say that I think I've hopefully illustrated that there's been a breadth of methodologies that have been used. So it's not been about using a single approach, but it's been about using the right approach to deal with the problems that are being witnessed. So that's gone from single-centre cohort studies to multi-centre studies to international cohort studies. And then it's broadened to including genetic studies, qualitative studies using health economics. The observational studies have extended to physiological studies and randomised controlled trials. And there's also been quite a marked evolution of statistical analysis. So statistical analysis in the 1990s often was mostly t-tests, and he's ended up working with the statisticians on graphical Markov models, which I can promise you are a world of difference in terms of complexity. I think the other observation that I would hope to make is that I think he's consistently built on the previous findings. So he's taken the core problems of what's happening to the PD patients and built on that to broaden the understanding and refine solutions to address those problems. So he's taken the observations around solute transport determining the outcome to where we are now with a fairly in-depth understanding of the role of inflammation that drives the vascularity and the fibrosis with that, and the subsequent deterioration in fluid balance and fluid distribution, and such that we now have a better understanding of that problem with the fluid balance and how we should improve it. I think the last thing I would have to say is that just on a sort of more personal note, which is to say that the other thing that Simon's been very good at is supporting all his colleagues, and just as a sort of personal illustration of that, I can safely say that I would not be working at Keele, and I don't think I'd be a clinical academic were it not for Simon. So that's the sort of level of impact he can have on the people he's worked with. And I think I will stop there.
Thank you, Mark. It's working now? Yeah, not yet. It's time to warm up. Well, thanks very much, Mark, because you've covered an awful lot of ground there very quickly, and really what I would like to say, just follow on from that, is that many of the collaborators in this room, and it's great to see people here I've collaborated with for years come to support me today. So thank you very much, all of you, on a personal note. I think we've got a couple of minutes if you want to ask any questions or make any points, or if not, we can always move on because it's over now. But I can pass on the mic to anyone who wants to talk.
Thank you, Mark and Simon. So, Mark, thank you for summarising. It would be quick to say which part of Personalise Simon has not informed. And you've alluded to that has been instrumental in your own career. We've heard lots about what Simon's done. How is that informing what you'll be doing next? Or another, you could answer, what's the thing that Simon didn't answer? That's left for you to.
There's nothing left.
I think there's a lot of opportunities still. I mean, I think a lot of it is going to be building on the work that we've just been talking about. So Intercept has got an obvious follow-on in terms of implementing the development, that the implementation package that's been developed. And I think there's definitely a study to be built on there. I think there's a variety of other bits of work from some of those cohort studies. And I think in terms of building on the randomised controlled trial stuff is again part of the, would have to be a fairly major goal for most people in terms of trying to influence PD, and just in terms of trying to make sure that, as Simon has done, make sure quality of methodology is cutting edge at the time. So I think the RCTs would have to be another focus within PD research.
Thank you.
Any other comments? I should have said at the beginning that Abida, here, one of my PhD students, is going to be helping with the microphone, moving it around. Okay. But also, I've asked him to take pictures. Clearly, if you don't want that, just indicate that you're not happy about it. But happy to get some pictures to record the event. We could have raising, Mark, that quite a few of your pictures look like I'm having a party.
I thought you'd appreciate the pictures.
Helen, there's a lot of says something about something. But it's always important to do that. I think Richard's saying it.
Thanks, Mark. So there's a final question. Which of his papers will you take to the desert island with you? Maybe we ask Simon which he would like to take to the desert island.
I think Simon should answer that one.
You want me to go first? Oh dear. I guess it's probably one of the early papers, to be honest. When I first demonstrated that membrane function was actually having an effect on survival, which I don't think anyone really expected. we thought that basically everyone's membranes would be the same. It turns out that there's more than 100% difference in membrane function between one person and another. Actually, the biggest degree of variability in a patient regarding peritoneal dialysis that we can get. So I think, although it's a very long time ago, it stood the test of time. We've been able to expand on that observation and understand why it's doing that. But I think actually making that the primary observation, and probably being the first person to properly make it, one or two hints in the literature already that this might be the case, but we were actually the first to publish it. And when that happens, when you publish something which is important, and then other people follow through and they make the same observation, so it's very reassuring. So I would say that probably at the end of the day is the most important.
Well, I think for me, probably one of the more recent papers. I think the Bistro study is a huge contribution to dialysis, and I think without that study, it was almost inevitable bioimpedance was going to creep into clinical practice, and it was going to be used in a way that people thought was helping when it wasn't, and it's going to be overinterpreted and overused. So I think for me, that's a sort of, it's a practice, even if it's a negative one, it's still practice changing. So either that, or probably, it's not quite out yet, but maybe one of the a summary intercept paper, because again, that is tackling one of the really big problems that we've got with home dialysis, which is the lack of usage where it would benefit patients. So I think in terms of impact, probably one of those ones would be one of the other ones. So I think they're the ones that for me are probably having the greatest impact, are those ones.